Hello beautiful people, my name is Venti and today, at long last, I'm bringing you my winter wrap-up. For me, the season of winter consists of December, January, and February, so this is going to be December 2019 and then January and February of 2020. As you may remember, one of my goals of 2020 was to read less to make a little more room for writing. However, that goal did not extend into December of the previous year, so I've got a lot of books to talk to you guys about. And with that said, I think it's just about time to get started because there is a lot of ground to cover. The first book that I've read in the month of December was Once and Future by Corey McCarthy and Amy Rose Capetta, and later in the season I also read Sword in the Stars, the sequel and conclusion to the duology. Once and Future follows our 42nd reincarnation of King Arthur, a girl named Ari, who alongside her group of friends has to work together to take down the big evil of their generation, which is a massive mega corporation that's taken over basically the entire universe. I'm not going to keep talking about these books because I literally just put a review up about 2 weeks ago on my channel, so you can check that out to see what I like. Spoiler alert, it's most of it. I think what I'll focus on for this video is the found family trope. I think it's beautifully done and really heart-wrenchingly done. As far as things I didn't like, I think that this series moved a little too quickly for my taste. The pace was absolutely breakneck, which makes it super easy to binge. However, I felt at times the story moving forward got in the way of certain side character developments that I would have liked to see. The problem was alleviated some in Sword in the Stars, but it was kind of a big detriment to Once and Future for me, at least personally. Overall though, I really love this duology and I think you should definitely pick it up. The second thing I read in December was Why Does He Do That by Lundy Bancroft. Why Does He Do That is a nonfiction book that delves into the different types of domestic abusers, their different mentalities and how they all really come down to one thing, and that is controlling the person that they're with, whether that be through physical or emotional or financial or whatever type of manipulation. He sort of breaks down how these men think, why they do the things they do, and also gives the women in these relationships, not just women, because obviously not only women are abused in relationships, but statistically, predominantly in heterosexual relationships, the men tend to be the abusers and the women tend to be the abused. Lundy Bancroft tells the victims of abuse how to get out in a way that's the safest and most emotionally fulfilling and likely to get closure for the victims of this abuse. I want to put out the disclaimer that I wasn't reading this because I feel like I'm in an abusive relationship, thank goodness. I am, however, writing about a character who is an abusive man, and as I've been fortunate enough not to have encountered too many of those in a way that affects my personal life very much, I thought it would be best to turn to the experts. I think Bancroft does an incredible job of providing resources and clarifying things in a very easy to understand way for people who need a lot of information very quickly and a lot of actionable information very quickly. So I think it's a very effective book. After that, I finished The Queen of Nothing, which is book 3 of the Folk of the Air trilogy by Holly Black. This is the conclusion to the series that begins with The Cruel Prince. As this is book 3, I can't really talk about what happens in this one without spoiling the first two, but The Cruel Prince follows Jude Duarte, a human girl who is whisked away into the land of fairy because her mom's ex-husband, who is Redcap, a very bloodthirsty fairy, kills her mother and father. And Jude has to navigate being human in a world that's ridiculously unfriendly to them, while also not really feeling at home or comfortable in the human world, so she needs to find out where she fits into the only world and only home she's ever known. The Queen of Nothing concludes Jude's story of political intrigue and finding her way not only to survive in the world of the Fae, but thrive in it. As far as things I liked about this book, I think that it came through and fulfilled one of the promises of The Cruel Prince, which was a super angsty enemies to lovers romance and a fairly satisfying arc for Jude. She really does come into her own and she does find her power as it differs from being Fae, because for a long time I think she tries to be as Fae as possible and imitate them. As far as things I'm disappointed in, I feel like The Wicked King raised the stakes like crazy from The Cruel Prince. I feel like The Queen of Nothing is on par with The Cruel Prince, but The Wicked King was just so high above the rest of them that I can't help but feeling a little bit let down with The Queen of Nothing. There's little like plot threads and little, I guess, red herrings that were dropped into The Wicked King that were never picked up and readdressed in The Queen of Nothing. Nevertheless, I still found it a really enjoyable read, and this is definitely a series that I recommend binging all 3 in one go. After that, I read Itazura na Kiss, or Mischievous Kiss, Volume 1 by Kaoru Tada. This was very kindly sent over to me by my booktube wife, Lou from Books Are a Way of Life, who I miss tremendously, and I can't wait for her to start posting again. So Lou, if you're watching, I miss you, babe. Itazura na Kiss follows Kotoko, a young high school girl who has basically, since she can remember, been in love with one of her classmates. But this classmate, Naoki, is sort of the golden child of the school. He has straight A's, he's top of the class, he's good at sports, he's good at basically everything, and Kotoko is not. And one day she gathers the courage to confess her feelings to Naoki. Unfortunately, Naoki rejects her in a very cold, rather callous way, and basically from there, Kotoko's life begins to turn upside down. Her house is ruined in an earthquake, and she and her father have to find somewhere to stay really quick so that she can finish her schooling and her father's business can continue to thrive. And where do they end up staying except the house of Naoki, because his father and Kotoko's dad were friends in high school. And the story goes from there, following the misadventures of these two and their sort of budding relationship. Not necessarily romantic, but that is where Kotoko wants to take it. I watched the K-drama of this first on recommendation from Lou and absolutely thoroughly enjoyed it. So one of the things I really loved about reading this was sort of getting to revisit all of the plot beats that were in the K-drama. I really love Kotoko and Naoki's dynamic. I think that they're just so funny to watch interact on the page, and there's a chemistry between them that I think is palpable even when he's being really cold to her, which I don't always love. I don't love it when people are cold to my cinnamon roll girls, but I think it's really funny and well done in this, and because I know how it ends, I'm not mad about it. As far as things I didn't like, there was a scene in this there wasn't in the K-drama, so small spoilers here. So my hand will come down when the spoilers are over. Basically, Kotoko is on a train and an older man tries to like sexually assault her on this train. And Naoki steps in and kind of stops it from happening, but he does a little bit victim blame her, and that put a really, really bad taste in my mouth. Those kind of scenes, those little like hidden like, ooh, bad things, are things that I want to watch out for before continuing with the series, but I think I would like to just because I miss the story. And right now I could use anything that makes me a little bit more happy, you know? Speaking of super happy reads, the next book I read was Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. I joke a little bit because obviously very, very dark themes in Ninth House, but it is a story that makes me ridiculously happy. In Ninth House, we follow Alex Stern, a freshman at Yale University who is there basically on a full ride scholarship. And the reason Alex is allowed in Yale, the reason she got this scholarship, is because she can, without the help of any potion or anything, see ghosts. And as such, she is perfectly primed to be an excellent candidate for the Ninth House, which is the ninth secret society of Yale, who keeps the other 8 houses in check as they do various occulty things to uplift the financial, political, etc. power of their alumni. And this is all well and good. Alex is moving up in the world. She's finally on track to have an easier life than she had growing up, until a townie girl gets found murdered and no one seems to care except for her. And then Alex has to go basically on a quest to figure out what is happening. As far as things I like, I love characters who have a lot to lose. And absolutely everything to gain. And Alex Stern is that 100-fold. She is difficult, she is complex, she's prickly, and she is so ambitious. She wants so hard to be given every chance in the world that she's been denied, and she sees people around her just throwing away second chances like they're nothing. And it's incredibly frustrating to her, but she's trying to hold her own despite not being primed to thrive in the world that she's living in. She's also ridiculously empathetic and caring of women whose stories are erased, because if it weren't for basically an accident of her birth, she would have been one of those women. She was almost one of those women. So just seeing women care about women, and this story of a woman fighting so hard to keep women like herself safe and secure is really empowering and uplifting, and I loved it so dearly for that reason. As far as things I didn't like, I will admit that the book is a little slow. It's going to be a slow burn series, but I really like that, and I think Leigh Bardugo does it well. So I don't really mind that too much, though I will say it did definitely extend the reading time of this book for me. Following that, I read This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Mortar and Max Gladstone. It follows Red and Blue, two agents who are basically like super soldiers, super spies from two potential futures. And they are tasked by their various worlds to go back in time and sort of shape moments in the past to make it more likely that their future is the one that will exist. I think it's sort of a zero-sum game where if one exists, the other cannot, just because they're two such diametrically opposed potential futures. So anyway, Red and Blue are sort of the peak examples of the super spies of each of their sides, and they begin to communicate with one another. And at first it starts as like this mocking, teasing, like, oh, we're gonna win and I'm gonna destroy you sort of thing. But eventually they begin to care about one another and take care of one another, and they fall in love despite everything about their DNA basically being wired to and programmed to destroy the other. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful sapphic love story. As far as things I love, I really love the repartee between Red and Blue. I think the letters that they write one another are beautiful and just hauntingly romantic. If two people are trying to kill each other at first and then their relationship blossoms into they would kill the entire world for the other person, that's my absolute shit. And as far as things I didn't like, I can't really say that I didn't like anything about this book. Because it's a novella, I'm normally a little iffy on those because I don't really feel like you can get enough story in so short a page count. I feel like it has to be done really ridiculously well. And I didn't have that problem with this book. I think it's just about a perfect book, and I don't say that lightly. After that, I read The Bing Chronicles by Cassandra Clare, Sarah Reese Brennan, and Maureen Johnson. This is a series of short stories following the life of Magnus Bane, the High Warlock of Brooklyn, bisexual icon, and love of Alexander Lightwood's life. In these stories, we really get a deep dive into Magnus, who was one of my favorite characters when I was reading these books. And we sort of get to see the Shadowhunter world from a different light. Instead of following Shadowhunters, we're now following a warlock and downworlders, and we're getting to see how the political structures and the ideologies, etc., of these people are different than those that we've been following in the rest of the Shadowhunters saga. And that's the thing I really like, in addition to getting a further exploration of one of my favorite characters from the story. Something I didn't like, I feel like tonally some of the stories felt not fitting with the rest of them. I know that Magnus is a more lighthearted character, but I feel like some of the stories are like a little too kooky, a little too zany, and there's not really like a point to them. And because one of them was one of the earlier ones, it was a little bit harder for me to get into, but overall, I really enjoyed this story, and I think it's a fun addition to the Shadowhunters saga. During the month of December, I was really into She-Ra, the little show, and so when I found out that Noelle Stevenson, now I forget, she's either the writer, like the show writer for She-Ra, or she's married to the show writer for She-Ra. Basically, when I found that out, I was like, I have to read something by Noelle Stevenson. So I picked up Moana, and this is a little graphic novel about a shape-shifting girl who apprentices herself to her town's villain. And it follows the shenanigans they get up to trying to do like villainous things, except we find out that nothing is really as it seems. The major governing body perhaps isn't as fair as they've led the world to believe. And as we're figuring all this out, we're also learning about Nimona, who and what she is. So as far as things I liked, I loved Nimona's dynamic with basically everyone, but especially the villain whose name escapes me right now. I just really love her little chaotic neutral self and the shenanigans that she gets into. I also loved the shape-shifting element and how that played into her really playful personality. I thought it was really cute to just see like Sharkhead Nimona appear on a panel. I thought it was a lot of fun and kept me really engaged page after page until I got to the end. As far as things I didn't like, not much of anything. I was really satisfied with Nimona as a story. I liked it quite a bit. And I actually gave my copy away to my best friend because I liked it so much and I wanted her to read it. So I'm looking to get myself my own copy again, just because it's one of those stories that I'd like to revisit. Speaking of stories that I'm definitely going to be revisiting over and over again, the next thing I read was Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. This is book 1 of the Farseer trilogy, which is trilogy 1 of the Greater Realm of the Elderlings saga. I am buddy reading this with my friend Katie from the channel A Sea of Tomes. This is one of her favorite series of all time, and I'm so enjoying my first experience of it being shared with somebody who has such a deep love and appreciation for these works. Assassin's Apprentice follows Fitz, who is the bastard of the king in waiting. He learns really quick that bastards, unless they can be made useful, often wind up dead. So when the opportunity presents itself for him to become a man of the king, to train to be an apprentice of the king's royal assassin, Fitz jumps right on it, and we follow his story from there. So as far as things I like about the series, I really loved following Fitz as a kid. I love following characters for a little bit longer because then you really get to see what shapes them, how it shapes them, and why it shapes them the way it does. Also, and I know it's a small thing, but it's also really not, I do love animal companions, and the way that Fitz interacts with animals makes me very, very happy. As far as things I didn't like, there's not much I didn't like. I think that it's definitely a little slow, and I do understand when people are put off by the series and don't continue with it because they think like it's really slow, but it gets so much better, and I'm so excited to continue reading it. Following Assassin's Apprentice, which is the beginning of a trilogy, I then concluded a trilogy by reading Dark Dawn by Jay Kristoff, which is the conclusion to the Nevernight Chronicle. Similarly to talking about Queen of Nothing, I can't really talk about Dark Dawn without spoiling the first two books, but as you undoubtedly know if you're a watcher of BookTube, Nevernight follows the story of Mia Corvair, a former rich, basically countess's daughter whose parents are murdered in a political upheaval when she is a child, who then trains to become an assassin so that she can get her revenge. And Dark Dawn closes up her story. And I can't accurately talk to you really about this book, having only summarized a sort of synopsis of book one, because of how much growth Mia and the rest of the characters go through. It's night and day. It really is how much things change. And that's part of the things that I really liked about this book. I loved seeing the conclusion of Mia's arc. I loved having her walls crumble around her. I loved the vulnerability that Jay Kristoff put her in, because she's not allowed to keep this sort of tough, rough facade of the assassin that she's forced herself to be. We see Mia who she really is, and that's just heartbreaking, and at the same time, like, you can't help but root for her when you see how vulnerable she is, because despite the vulnerability, she still keeps fighting because she believes in a better life for herself, for whatever family she has left, for her friends, for her lover. It's beautiful. Jay Kristoff did not take this series in the direction I thought he was going to take it in after I finished Nevernight, but the trajectory that he did put Mia on, I feel like concludes really well with Dark Dawn. Actually, yeah, there's one thing I didn't like so much. I knew that no character was really safe, but there were a few character deaths that just felt gratuitous, and like after the first surprise death, none of the rest of them were really surprising, because it's always like, oh, they'll be fine, psych, no they won't. And after one or two times, it's like, okay, yeah, I know, you're introducing this character because you're about to kill them brutally and it's gonna hurt our souls. I get it. I feel like one or two fewer instances of that sort of thing would have made this book just absolutely perfection in my eyes, I think. And the final book that I read in the month of December was Vengeful by Victoria Schwab, or V.E. Schwab, I believe. Vengeful follows Sydney, the girl that Victor Vale adopted in Vicious, but she is all grown up now and sort of discovering who she is and what her power is without the guiding force of Victor around her. It also centers Marcella, a new EO who develops her power after being basically brutally killed by her husband in a fire. And her ambition is basically to tear down the hyper-masculine, cruel to women criminal underground that her husband was a part of, basically by becoming the leader of it. It's sort of a, it's better to reign in hell than serve in heaven sort of situation. So as far as things I really like in the villain series how V.E. Schwab uses a flip between flashback chapters and then present day chapters, and both are short, so that you sort of get the backstory and the reasoning for the present by having just read the thing in the past that motivated it. You sort of see how character motivations and plot points are brought in from what happened before shaping what is happening now, and I really enjoy that as a framing device. I also really enjoyed that we didn't have to do that as much for Sydney because we saw her as a child, and I super enjoyed seeing her grow up and no longer be a kid who's sort of a player to be pushed around by others, but a fully autonomous human being. There was one big main thing that bummed me out about Vengeful, and it was that this was an all-woman casted, or a mostly woman casted book, sort of in response to the hyper maleness that Vicious was centering. But despite that intent, I still felt the story to be fairly focused on Eli and Victor and their dynamic. So focused on the men of the previous story and on a lot of the men of the current new story. The book sort of felt like a reverse Messiah story, at least as far as Marcella's character is concerned, but I think not enough focus was placed on her. I think we spent a little too much time focusing on Victor and his new life post Eli to really get into Marcella as a character by herself. And I would have loved to see like her dynamic and her and June's dynamic in particular with regards to that as women who were hurt by men and who are rising sort of above it. I also think the story maybe would have done better if Marcella was allowed to seek power without being actively punished for it basically right away. And perhaps the whole point of the Villains series is that seeking ultimate power ultimately leads to self-destruction. However, despite being built up as a super clever and calculating character, Marcella supernovaed a lot faster than, for example, Eli did, who I guess was her foil character from the previous book. And two, she ended up destroying herself instead of being destroyed by somebody else, somebody outsmarting her, because apparently ambition is a toxic cancer to women. Overall, my feelings for the story are complicated and I really enjoyed it, but I think I would have enjoyed it more had I read it like circa 2016 when my patience for mansplainers and just hyper masculine assholes was at an all-time low. Like if I read it when it was being written, I think it would have spoken to me a little more, and I can definitely see how it was a cathartic book for Victoria Schwab to write. However, I just didn't respond to it the day that I read it. So that's really it for the month of December. The month of January was less good. I only read 2 books in their entirety. And the first one that I read, I'm so glad it was the first book that I finished in the year 2020, was Call Down the Hock by Maggie Stiefvater. Call Down the Hock is the opening of what's going to be known as the Dreamer Trilogy, a series following Ronan Lynch, one of the Raven boys from Maggie Stiefvater's The Raven Cycle. Ronan is struggling with feelings of isolation because he has found that he can't really leave his home and still dream properly. He is struggling because he feels like he's stuck in time when everyone else, including the love of his life, is moving forward. He's also struggling because he thinks he's the only dreamer in the world because obviously his father's dead and neither of his brothers are dreamers. But then the criminal underground catches up to him and gets in Ronan's business way more than he initially anticipated. And alongside his brothers, Declan, who is sort of criminal mastermind himself in a way, but trying so desperately not to be to protect himself and his family, and his little brother Matthew, who is a living dream, as well as another dreamer that they meet, a girl named Jordan Hennessy, whose dreams are literally killing her. Ronan is figuring out what it means to be a dreamer, how he is going to be a dreamer, and how he is going to keep himself safe from the forces at play that are trying to destroy all of his kind. So it's a lot, it's wild, and I can't wait for the sequel. As far as things I liked, everything. I love Ronan Lynch, I love Adam Parrish, and I love Maggie Stiefvater's world building. It's always just a little bit uncanny, it's always just a little bit quirky, and I do like that she is expanding what we knew from the Raven Cycle about Ronan, because I feel like he was a really interesting player there, but we couldn't explore what he was beyond what he meant in the dynamic of the Raven Cycle. So as far as things I didn't like, I feel like I am peeved that this is called like a completely standalone series when you obviously really do need to read the Raven Cycle if you're going to completely understand this. There's a lot of shorthand used for characterization that if you're a brand new reader, you're not going to understand. You're not going to understand why Ronan is the way he is unless you have the backstory of who he was previously. The next and final book that I finished in the month of January was The Devouring Grey by Christine Lynn Herman, and my goodness, was it a perfect time to pick this book up. The Devouring Grey follows 4 teens, Violet Saunders, Justin Hawthorne, Harper Carlyle, and Isaac Sullivan. Each of these teens are the current, basically, heirs of the four founding families of Four Paths, a small sleepy town in the New Englandish area, I believe. Violet has previously lived outside of Four Paths, and she and her mother moved to the town after the death of her older sister. So while struggling with her grief and struggling with being the new girl in school again, Violet also has to come to terms with the fact that she, as a founder, has these pretty gnarly and intense supernatural powers that give her the responsibility as a founder to protect the citizens of Four Paths from the Devouring Gray, a beast in the woods. As far as things I like about the Devouring Gray, I think that it's a beautiful exploration of grief and the way that it sometimes feels like it physically manifests, especially for teens. I think Christine Lynn Herman writes teenage characters very, very well. She knows what makes them tick. She knows how they respond emotionally to charged things. She knows that every emotional trauma feels like the greatest one that there ever was and ever will be. And I think it's just really relatable from that. And as far as things I didn't like, some things were maybe a little too easy, if that makes sense. I don't know how to explain this without giving concrete examples, and I try to keep my wrap-ups and my reviews spoiler-free for the most part, but I feel like some things about Violet figuring out stuff about her power and her family's power were done too simply because the plot required them to move forward, and other things were done with too much difficulty because the plot needed those secrets to be kept for a little while in order for the plot to move forward. It was a little like railroady, it felt like, and I generally tend to like books where you can't feel the author's hand as much. The first book that I read in the month of February, the first book that I read for the Blackathon was On the Comeup by Angie Thomas. On the Comeup follows Bree, a rapper from Garden Heights, which is the neighborhood that you might recognize from Angie Thomas's first novel, The Hate U Give. And Bree is a lyricist trying to make it in her own light without being constantly forced to be in her father's shadow, as her father was a very prominent, very successful rapper from the area before her, prior to his passing. But after her mother loses her job and it becomes questionable whether they're going to be able to stay in their home and keep the lights on and keep the water bill paid and food in the fridge, Bree realizes that making this career happen is more than just a matter of pride. So as far as things I like, I believe that Angie Thomas can do basically no wrong in her writing. I think that this was a stunning, beautiful novel. Angie Thomas is a wordsmith, so having her write about a female writer like Bree was just a beautiful thing to behold. I think one of the standout features of this book was the lyrics, because Angie Thomas wrote raps for Bree in this book, and if you listen to On the Comeup on audio the way that I did, you actually get to hear them performed, and it's beautiful. It tied so thematically to Bree finding her voice and finding a way to speak out and be herself and find herself in a world that is so hell-bent on forcing her into stereotypes and boxes that she just doesn't fit into. The family and the friendship dynamics were so beautiful and so pure. There's such an undercurrent of love in every family that Angie Thomas writes, and as a person with a very close, loving family myself, it's just something I'm drawn to every single time, and I love to see it. And I didn't really have anything that I didn't like about this book. Bree is a teenager and she acts like a teenager, so sometimes she makes choices that are like so frustrating when you look at them from the point of view of an adult, but they make sense for who she is and they make sense for what she has to work with at the time, so I'm not really mad about it. After this, I read Holy Sister, the conclusion to the Red Sister trilogy by Mark Lawrence. This series follows an assassin nun named Nona Gray, who at the start of the series is taken into the convent and basically put into assassin nun training. This book takes place in a world that's basically being plagued by an ice age caused by a very weak sun. The only corridor of inhabitable land that people can live on is kept there and kept alive by a reflective moon but the corridor is slowly shrinking, and of course political tensions are running high. This class of assassin nuns is sort of at the beck and call of the emperor of one of these kingdoms, but Nona, in her youth, because she has some powers that were granted to her through her blood, has caused some trouble and some animosity with one of the emperor's main noble families. This was a terrible summary of these books, but there's just so much going on. in them that I don't know how to do it better. I highly recommend that you just read them and see for yourself. I love Nona Gray so much. She is very much a punch first, ask questions later person. Despite being caught in so much political intrigue, she has no ambitious or diplomatic bones in her body. She's not like this, but she's fiercely loyal to her friends. I loved seeing not only her interactions with other people, but I loved seeing her grow into the various powers that she has. Really good that despite all of those powers that she has, she is not overpowered. She's still pretty readily gets her ass kicked by various other people. And there's not much that I didn't like about Holy Sister or about any of the series. This is an excellent trilogy. I can't wait to read basically everything else Mark Lawrence has ever written. After that, I read Sword in the Stars, which I've already talked about. And following that, I read The 100,000 Kingdoms by N.K. Jemisin. And oh my goodness. N.K. Jemisin books, the description of them escapes me just because the scopes of their worlds are so big. So The 100,000 Kingdoms is the first book in the Inheritance trilogy, and this one follows Yeine Dar, who is the clan leader of basically a race considered like sort of barbarians in the north of the 100,000 Kingdoms. Yeine is called to the castle, the hub of the 100,000 Kingdoms, by the king, and is informed that she has been chosen to be one of the 3 cousins who will compete to be his heir upon his passing, because he's getting up there in age. In this hub, the city of Sky, Yeine finds out the truth about her family and their ancestry, how they rose to power by enslaving basically gods, and how they've kept that power through blood and magic. And she's tossed into this power struggle between herself and her cousins to stay alive and become the ruler of these 100,000 kingdoms, while also forming bonds with these enslaved gods who have, for whatever reason, taken a very vested interest in her particularly. As far as things I like, literally everything about this book is excellent. Like the 5th season, The 100,000 Kingdoms sort of straddles the line between sci-fi and fantasy. Magic is just stuff that science hasn't explained yet, but also is still very like mystical in its nature, and I really love the way that she does that in terms of world building. But my favorite part of this story has to be Yeine herself, the main character that we follow. She's just so empathetic and heartfelt, and the relationship she has with the gods such as Enifade is incredibly touching to read. The city of Sky and all of her cousins are basically a cesspool and just a pit of snakes and ruthless, awful people. So when you see somebody as deep down good and wanting to do good for as many people as possible as Yeine thrown in there and sort of expected to survive against all odds, you have to root for her. As far as things I didn't like, I feel like we were told a lot more about relationships rather than seeing them sort of build more organically on page. This led to semi-insta-lovey feelings for at least a little bit of it, but it's complicated in the same way that Daughter of Smoke and Bone is complicated about insta-love. I don't know. Some of the relationships felt a little bit shoehorned in and forced, and I would have loved to see a little more page time devoted to having those develop. But other than that, pretty much a perfect book. I can't wait to continue with this series. After that, I read The Deep by Rivers Solomon. The Deep is pretty much about mermaids, but a very different take on mermaid lore than you might be used to if you're used to stories like The Little Mermaid. In this story, mermaids are the descendants of the African women who were tossed overboard for being pregnant on slave ships during the Atlantic slave trade. Basically, the babies in their wombs came out and emerged as water-breathing creatures, mermaids, pretty much. They have tails, they have fins and gills, and they, as a race, collectively pretty much have amnesia. They forget everything except for one. And the one that we follow in The Deep is Yetu, and she is the historian of her generation of these mermaids. The Deep is a novella that I think is less a story and more an exploration of an idea, and the idea is intergenerational trauma and how we handle it. The mermaids in this story all forget the history of their people because it is so horrific and so sad that to remember it consumes them, basically. There is a ritual during which the historian returns the memories to her people once a year and reminds them who they are to sort of reconnect them as a species. They all come together, the historian gives them the memories, and she finally gets a reprieve from having to hold the entire history and the entire trauma of every single mermaid in her head the whole time. Obviously, that is a big burden for anyone to bear, so Yetu, the current historian, who is already super empathetic, when she gets rid of these memories and gives them to her people, she realizes this is her chance to escape. She can leave them with this suffering, and live a free life unburdened from this trauma. I have a hard time separating like a thing I liked and a thing I didn't like from this, just because it's a bigger story than me, and I feel like to classify it with, you know, these were the points I enjoyed, these are the points I didn't, is to detract from the importance and coolness of the story. I guess if we're talking about things I liked, I think it was an incredibly well done exploration of the idea of intergenerational trauma and how a shared history can hurt, but it's also a thing to be celebrated because it shapes who you are, and it shapes your strength. And as far as things I didn't like, this is definitely one of those cases where I wish there were more story. I feel like it was such an interesting concept that I would have loved to see this as a bigger thing. Evocative story, it's a very important story, and I do recommend you read it, but I wish it was longer. We're in the home stretch now. I think just like 3 more books, and good thing too, because my upper respiratory symptoms plus all this talking is drying my throat out like crazy. After that, I finished The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. It's another book that I'm buddy reading with Katie from A Sea of Tomes. I'm not gonna explain the plot of The Hobbit because it's a classic. You either know it or, well, you know it at this point. If you haven't, I don't know what rock you're living under. As far as things I liked on this reread, again, I mean, it's one of my favorite stories of all time. So reading it with Katie, who is also another J.R.R. Tolkien aficionado. I don't actually know how to pronounce that word. Another huge fan of J.R.R. Tolkien, was really great because I got to see all of her favorite parts as well. We got some really deep discussions on those things. In this reread, I really focused a lot on the dwarves. I think that their dynamics and their senses of humor and stuff can so easily be overlooked in a story like The Hobbit, but they were so wonderfully done and a beautiful cast of characters in this reread that you can't help but fall in love with every single one of them. Also, Riddles in the Dark is maybe my favorite chapter of fiction ever written. As far as things I didn't like when it ended, because that meant the story was over. Following this, I read Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Daisy Jones and the Six is basically a book form of a documentary about a singer and a band, Daisy Jones and the Six, respectively. Grew to fame in the 60s and then fell apart, and this documentary is like an expose on what really happened, how both Daisy Jones and the Six grew to that level of fame and star power, and then how it all crashed down. As far as things I liked, I really enjoyed how it was told. I think Daisy Jones is one that I would reread just to read it on audio. It really felt like one of those band documentaries that I have many fond memories of watching with like my dad. Having that audio input, having various characters actually speak their voices would bring it one step closer to that sort of feeling for me, and I think I'd really enjoy that. I think that the explorations of addiction were incredibly powerful and quite well done, and I think that Taylor Jenkins Reid is a master of getting you to feel like the story takes place in the era she's writing about. She does really, really good historical fiction. As far as things I didn't like, I don't like Taylor Jenkins Reid's like twists, her haha got you moments. I feel like her stories, like the way that she presents them, are strong enough that she doesn't have to rely on them. There were a million different times when this information could have been presented to us. Like, I wish that we were given the opportunity to guess where the twist was coming from in a way that we weren't, because it would have been so easy to let that happen. And I feel like it would have been super satisfying to guess it and to be like, haha, I knew it. Or if the clues were dropped there, and even if you didn't get it by the time the twist happened, you could go back and be like, oh, I see how she was planting that thing, instead of having it feel like a big Deus Ex Machina at the end. So that was really frustrating because I didn't feel like it needed to happen. But overall, I did enjoy the story. And the final book that I read in the month of February, and the final book that I read in the season of winter 2019-2020 was The Mammoth Hunters by Jean M. Auel. This is book 3 of the Clan of the Cave Bear Earth's Children series. The story of Clan of the Cave Bear follows Ayla, a Cro-Magnon girl who's adopted by a clan of Neanderthals. So she spends her formative years living with a group of people who are really similar to her, but ultimately not the same, like species-wise. culture-wise. Then when she has to leave the clan later in her life, she finds that she is just as much of a misfit because of her upbringing in the world of the Cro-Magnons, like the regular humans. The Mammoth Hunters follows Ayla as an adult after she has met up with a human man named Jondalar. As the third book in a 6-book series, again, I can't really talk about it without spoiling the previous books, but I feel like because this is such a backlist title, I don't feel as bad about that. I also don't anticipate it being like such a hot book for folks to pick up, so I don't feel as bad spoiling it either, in case it's something you're interested in. So as far as things I liked about this book, or I guess the series as a whole so far, I feel like Clan of the Cave Bear sort of let Ayla develop as a young girl and as a teen in a society that she was inherently an outsider in. So it was really interesting to see her sort of hold her own and figure out where she could find value in herself and provide value to others, because providing value to others and keeping family bonds was really the only way that people survived during this time. So you see her in the context of being other and developing all these skills that will be necessary for her later. In the sequel to that, Valley of Horses, you see Ayla in isolation, having to learn how to use those skills, but be by herself, and then realize that she doesn't want to be by herself, that she wants to be part of a greater clan again, but realizing that she can't go back to the Neanderthals because she's just not one of them. She has to find human people and find a way to integrate herself in there. I really like the Mammoth Hunters because we get to see Ayla finally interacting with people like her. It's really interesting for me to see this girl that I basically like watched grow up and am rooting for, finding new ways to thrive in a society that's just so different from what she's grown up seeing and what she's used to. As far as things I didn't like, so I'm buddy reading these books with my friend Celise from A Book Armada, who I'll have linked in the description box below. And we sort of share opinions about this book in that we're trash for this series, but at the same time, like after Clan of the Cave Bear, it's basically turned into like a historical romance a little bit, where the focus is to an almost uncomfortable extent on Ayla's romantic focus and who she's going to end up with and the sex that she has with them. There's a lot of sex in these books. Sometimes the consent feels a little dubious, which I wasn't a huge fan of. But overall, like I said, I'm trash for this series. It feels a little bit like Caveman Outlander at this point. So if you really like Outlander and you're into more like historical romance with like a pretty solid emphasis on the history part, definitely give Clan of the Cave Bear a try. It's quite interesting. And there you have it at long last, friends. That is my winter wrap-up of December 2019 through February 2020. It's pretty late in the evening that I'm filming this, so I'm gonna go head to bed and hydrate so that my throat isn't absolutely dead for work tomorrow, because I have a lot of meetings to get to. So thank you so much for watching this video. I know it's probably a marathon, so double thank you if you stuck through the whole thing. If you liked it, please leave me a thumbs up, and if you like me, maybe consider subscribing to my channel. I post videos every Thursday, and I'd love for you to be part of my little booktube family. As a sort of side note, after the spring of 2020, so my next wrap-up is going to happen roundabouts the end of May, I think I'm going to abandon the seasonal wrap-up format, just because I read such a great volume that it doesn't really make sense for my throat or my sanity or my filming time to film a wrap-up of this magnitude every time. So the next sort of collective wrap-up is going to be the spring one for March, April, and May of 2020. Then after that, I think I'm going to switch to a recent reads format. My reviewing style will be the same, where I tell you a brief synopsis, some likes and some dislikes, but they're probably going to happen a little more frequently, just to save my poor voice. But now that that's out of the way, I think that's it for me. Thank you guys again so much for watching, and I will see you with my next video very soon. Goodbye.